Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's Mr. Zabo. This video is going to talk about solving quadratic equations by taking square roots. It's the first video on that topic, and so it's going to be fairly basic. In further chapters we're going to take this an extra step and have to do a few additional things, but for right now the main focus is going to be this. When we get x squared equals, so we get an x squared all by itself on one side of the equal sign. The opposite of squaring something is taking its square root. So to figure out what x is equal to, I am going to square root both sides of this equation. There's only one thing that multiplies to give me x squared, and that's x. Okay? X times x is x squared, so the square root of x squared is x. And then what multiplies to give me 36? That's 6 times 6, so I get 6. Now, what's tricky about this is, because I'm solving this, there is technically a second number that would actually multiply to give me 36 when I multiply by itself. And that number is negative 36. So it's true that 36 is 6 times 6, but it's also true that 36 is negative 6 times negative 6. So when I'm answering this, I have to state that there are two solutions, x equals plus or minus 6. That's typically the way that we would write this. It's saying that x could be equal to 6 or x could be equal to negative 6. Alright, now let's take a look at this second example. The concept is the same because when I square root both sides, because I have x squared by itself, I'm allowed to get just the x by itself here. But what multiplies by itself to give me negative 4? The answer is nothing. There is no number I can multiply by to give me a negative inside. Multiply by itself to give me a negative inside the square root. So in this case, we would say that this has no real solutions. More definitions as to why it's no real solutions much later on. And that happens anytime you have a negative inside your square root. If the negative is outside, different story. Inside, cannot do it. In these three examples, there's some small differences. The biggest is, in the first two examples, we had x squared equals. Now, I don't. I have x squared minus 100 equals. I can't square root both sides until I have x squared by itself. I've isolated the x squared. So, in this case, that means I'm going to add 100 to both sides of my equal sign, giving me x squared equals 100. Now that x squared is by itself, I can take the square root of both sides. Square root of x squared is x. Square root of 100 is 10, because it's 10 times 10. But it also could be negative 10. Remember, square rooting both sides is saying what value could I substitute in for x to give me 100? Well, I could put negative 10 in there. Negative 10 squared is 100. I could put positive 10 in there. 10 squared is 100. So I have two solutions here. The difference in the second example is that not only do I have to add to both sides, so all of my processes we learned first semester are still in play, but I still don't have x squared by itself. I also have to divide both sides by 3. Now I get x squared equals 25, and I can square root both sides. In doing so, we get x is equal to not 5, but positive or negative 5. Two possible solutions. And in the third example, I have to divide both sides by negative 2 to get my x squared by itself, which will allow me to square root both sides, but that's our key situation from above. I cannot take the square root of a negative number. I'm going to state that there are no real solutions. Last but not least in this video is an application problem. So if I give you this word problem that says a rock falls off a cliff 704 feet above the ground, and a function h equals negative 16t squared, plus 704 represents the height, which is h, of the rock after t seconds. When will the rock hit the ground? First key thing to understand is when I ask this question, when the rock hits the ground, I have to understand that that's a height, and then when it hits the ground, that height is 0 feet. So I'm going to take my original function, negative 16t squared plus 704, and I'm going to substitute 0 for h. I want to figure out what t is equal to. Well, you can see I have negative 16t squared plus 704. I can get t squared by itself and square root both sides to solve this. Now, I like working with positive numbers, so I'm going to add 16t squared to both sides here. I get 16t squared equals 704. Now, divide both sides by 16 and get t squared equals 44. Square root both sides. And here we get a decimal. Now, algebraically, I am getting that t is equal to plus or minus, because remember, I'm square rooting both sides, and we just talked about that gives us two possible answers. 6.6332 and so on, and I'll just round it there. But realistically, because this is a word problem, there's some context around this. T represents time. Can t be a negative time? I'll answer that question for you. It's no. So this actually restricts my domain. My domain has to be positive numbers. So I couldn't answer this as my final answer. I would have to say that t is equal to the positive answer only of approximately 6.63 or 6.63 seconds. So this is where we talked about earlier in the chapter. There are sometimes restrictions on your domain, in particular when you're dealing with word problems.